Well, here, the first thing I'm seeing is the dad taking that heavy sigh as soon as he asks that question. And I think what we're seeing there is it's almost like, okay, here we go. He's done it quite a few times at this point. We're 3 weeks in after she's been missing.
What would you expect from two devastated parents whose 3-year-old daughter has just vanished without a trace? Tears, panic, desperate pleas for help. Now imagine the opposite: calmness, controlled speech, smiles, tennis. That's exactly what the world saw when Gerry and Kate McCann appeared on camera after Madeline went missing. But was this just the trauma response of two rational doctors? Or were there subtle clues in their expressions, gestures, and word signs that something wasn't right from the very beginning? In this in-depth analysis, we unpack every frame, every phrase, and every flicker of emotion or lack thereof through the lens of body language experts and forensic behavior analysts. This isn't about accusations. This is about reading the unsaid. 3 weeks had passed since Madeleine McCann vanished from apartment 5EA at the Ocean Club Resort in Praia da Luz, Portugal. In that time, global headlines exploded, timelines were questioned, and a controlled PR strategy appeared to emerge. But in this moment captured on video, broadcast around the world, Kate and Gerry McCann sat down for their first televised interview, facing pointed questions not crafted by their press team, but delivered by an external interviewer. According to 4 seasoned body language experts, Greg Hartley, Chase Hughes, Mark Bowden, and Scott Rose was likely the most unfiltered glimpse the public would get into the couple's real emotions. It was fresh, as one of them put it, not yet diluted by rehearsal, legal coaching, or narrative polishing. For investigators of human behavior, this moment mattered. This is the first time they're in front of an interviewer. This is probably our best chance to see truthfulness before they've had too much time to rehearse. The interviewer's first question cut directly to the heart of the matter. Tell us how you discovered Madeline was gone. Before answering, Gerry McCann exhales deeply, a prolonged, deliberate sigh. It wasn't a theatrical gesture or a ploy for sympathy. Experts interpreted it as a classic, emotional ramp-up, the body preparing for a familiar pain. One of them described it as the moment you reach the top of a roller coaster. Not fear, but the quiet resignation of having to relive trauma again, in public. He lets out a big heavy sigh. It's like, here we go. It's what you see when someone has had to relive trauma many times. Beside him, Kate McCann appears small, quiet, emotionally shrunken. Her voice is almost brittle, nearly breaking. She speaks in low volume and clutches tightly to a soft doll, reportedly one of Madeline's. Her posture is not defensive, but withdrawn. Her hands do not fidget or build barriers between her and the interviewer. Instead, they cling to the doll like an emotional anchor, something tangible to hold on to amid emotional fog. Experts noted the presence of the guilt muscle, a telltale curve in the muscles between the eyes and lips, difficult to fake. It typically appears in individuals experiencing profound loss or sorrow, and it was evident in Kate's expression. But it wasn't just her facial muscles that spoke volumes. Her voice is brittle. She's trying to hold back something. She's gripping the doll, not a barrier, but an emotional anchor. Her gaze is all internal, down left, down right. She's in her own world of processing. Kate's eyes rarely meet the camera. Instead, they drift downward and to the side, signals of internal emotional processing. Rather than interacting with the interviewer or audience, she appears to be navigating her own grief in real time. This isn't necessarily suspicious. It is, in fact, what many expect from trauma. But it stands in stark contrast to Gerry's composed, articulate demeanor, and that difference only grows more stark as the interview unfolds. When grief looks different, expert reflections on parental loss. One of the experts, himself a father who had lost a child, offered a deeply personal lens. After 3 weeks, there's no emotion left. You're just a shell. People expect tears, but the glass is empty. From this perspective, the blank effect, the emotional flatness often criticized by the public, might not be abnormal. In grief, especially after trauma, emotions are not always linear. There is no textbook way to look devastated. And yet, there was something unorthodox about this interview. Kate and Gerry did not cry. They did not beg the camera for help. They did not plead for their daughter's return. They did not even describe her in terms of fear or suffering. They described her in the past tense. They talked about how beautiful she was. They did not speak about what Madeline might be going through or the horror of her possible situation. Instead, their words were logical, controlled, disconnected from panic or dread. And that lack of performance ironically raised more suspicions. Not trying to convince anyone. And that's the problem from a psychological perspective. There is a strange dissonance when someone in a tragic situation makes no attempt to connect emotionally with others. In the case of the McCanns, experts noted the absence of any resume statements. Phrases like, "We're good parents," "We love our child," or "Wa would never do anything to hurt her," which are often used instinctively by innocent people to reassure or clarify. The McCanns offered none. They're not trying to convince you. That, ironically, makes people feel more suspicious. Gerry and Kate made no emotional appeals to the audience. There was no, "If you're watching, please bring her back." There was no open anger toward a hypothetical abductor. There was no symbolic collapse into grief. There was simply absence. And in the world of body language analysis, absence speaks loudly. The team of experts was cautious not to jump to conclusions. Trauma is unpredictable. Stoicism is not a crime. But there was a shared consensus that this wasn't how most parents behave in the public eye when their child is missing. In fact, many who have studied the interview noted that the McCanns appeared more focused on maintaining composure and managing optics than on expressing raw emotion. Some interpreted this as a reflection of their medical background, trained to suppress emotion in clinical settings. Others saw it as strategic containment, designed to uphold a certain image. Blank effect trauma or image control. Throughout the interview, both parents maintained a calm, nearly flat demeanor. This was most stark when compared to other cases when parents appeared on television barely able to speak, consumed by desperation. The McCanns, by contrast, seemed measured, polished, in control. This could, of course, be a result of shock, or a trauma response, or simply how two doctors process overwhelming grief. But there's another interpretation: media image control. Aware of the global stage they were on, they may have been coached or self-aware to the point of paralysis, so concerned with how they were perceived that any genuine emotion was neutralized. This theory is supported by their later media strategy: controlled releases, curated photos, coordinated statements, and even branding decisions. The interview, then, may have been the first step in a calculated public relations campaign, and that alone isn't criminal. But when authentic emotion is consistently absent, and the only visible behavior is message-driven, the public starts to wonder, what are they hiding? In law enforcement and forensic psychology, there's a concept known as baseline behavior. The idea that the first, raw reaction in a crisis can reveal more than all the rehearsed statements that follow. For the McCanns, that baseline was recorded in this very interview. What it showed was not deception, but it wasn't quite authenticity either. It showed controlled grief, emotional containment, and strategic restraint. It showed two parents who were either emotionally depleted or emotionally distant. And as the camera rolled, and the world watched, what we saw was not a plea, not a breakdown, not even outrage. What we saw was silence where there should have been noise, stillness where there should have been trembling. And that, for many, is the most haunting part of all. In criminal investigations involving missing children, law enforcement often turns to body language experts to evaluate not just what the parents say, but how they say it. What their hands do, how their voice flows, when their face breaks. These nonverbal cues are often the first cracks in a rehearsed story or the raw truth seeping through trauma. But what happens when there's nothing at all? No hand movement, no animated speech, no visible sorrow. This was the perplexing case in the first televised interview of Gerry and Kate McCann, just 3 weeks after their daughter Madeline went missing. According to experts trained in behavioral analysis and deception detection, What was most striking wasn't what the McCanns said, but what they didn't do. To understand what was absent, we first need to understand what's expected. Adaptive gestures are subconscious behaviors that people engage in when under emotional stress. These include rubbing one's hands together, adjusting clothing, running fingers through hair, or locking fingers. In situations of fear or high anxiety, adaptive gestures serve as self-soothing mechanisms, something to ground the person physically when their emotional world is unraveling. Illustrators, on the other hand, are purposeful hand movements that complement speech. These help emphasize a point, clarify intent, or highlight emotional tone. When someone recounts an emotionally significant experience, illustrators usually appear in bursts, flicks of the hand, open palms, animated gestures, because the speaker is emotionally engaged with the memory. But in the McCanns interview, neither category appeared in any significant way. There are no barriers whatsoever. The illustrators are minimal, if any. Kate McCann's only visible hand activity was holding a small doll, said to have belonged to Madeline. Experts viewed this not as a defensive barrier or deceptive prop, but as a comforting object, a silent form of self-protection. It served more as an emotional anchor than an intentional tool of communication. Gerry, by contrast, sat still, composed, calm. His hands rested in place. His voice was steady. His movements, if any, were subtle, controlled. If there was grief, it was internalized. There were no gestural peaks, no flailing, no evidence of emotional turbulence reaching the surface. They don't try to convince. There's no resume statement, no attempt to elicit sympathy. In many past cases, parents accused of crimes involving their children tend to overcompensate, crying too much, gesturing wildly, or proclaiming their innocence through exaggerated appeals. The McCanns did none of that, and that, paradoxically, made them harder to read and easier to doubt. One of the most consistent observations about Gerry McCann's communication was that he spoke like a cardiologist, not a desperate father. His speech was linear, logical, and emotionally flat. Every answer was well structured. Every phrase seemed calculated to inform, not to express. He's a cardiologist. He's used to delivering bad news. So his answer is structured, tight, emotionless, exactly what he's trained for. This kind of delivery is not inherently suspicious. In fact, it might be exactly what one would expect from a man trained to remain calm in operating rooms and deliver life-shattering diagnoses without flinching. But in the context of a missing child, the absence of emotional modulation, of rawness, was jarring. Kate, by comparison, spoke less. Her voice was low, her tone flat. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't crack. She didn't fall apart. And while some might say this is evidence of trauma, of emotional depletion, others found it too neat, too contained, too quiet. There were no surges of anger toward a possible kidnapper, no pleas, no desperate appeals, no confusion, no chaos. What truly alarmed behavioral analysts wasn't just the tone, it was the content. Throughout the interview, neither parent expressed concern for what Madeline might be feeling or experiencing. There were no questions like, "I wonder if she's scared. I hope she's not hurt. Where could she be now?" Instead, the focus remained on how Madeline looked and how perfect she was. The language they used was predominantly past tense, describing her as if she were already gone. We hear a repeated focus on how beautiful and perfect she was, not what she might be feeling. Phrases like, "She was perfect," "She looked so beautiful," and "She was so loved," filled their answers. These might have been slips, natural switches in tense, but to analysts trained to detect patterns, the consistent use of past tense for a still missing child was troubling. This phenomenon was labeled by one expert as temporal disconnection, when a speaker frames someone still presumed alive in the language of death. It suggested, intentionally or not, that the McCanns had already emotionally detached from the possibility that Madeline was still alive. And this, to many viewers, felt cold, detached, even disturbing. Beyond gestures and grammar, the McCanns' interview revealed something more nuanced, a fundamental disconnect between intellect and emotion. Gerry leaned on statistics. He referenced a 1 in 100 million chance, of the abduction. He pointed out that many parents do the same thing, referring to leaving their children in nearby hotel rooms. He used phrases like safe resort, routine checks, and social reassurance. He was calm, rational, reasoned, but he wasn't grieving. Kate, meanwhile, offered no significant emotional language, no statements like, "I miss her every second," or "This is destroying me." There were no tears, no shakiness, no admissions of internal chaos. And even in her stillness, there was no visible emotional leakage, just a quiet, persistent blankness. There's a disconnect between their intellect and their emotions. Everything sounds like a report, not a cry. They're in logic mode when the world expects heartbreak. This dissonance between the scientific poise of their words and the emotional vacuum of their bodies left many experts unsettled. It's not that the McCanns were deceptive. It's that they weren't emotionally congruent. No one can say definitively how a parent should behave when their child vanishes. Trauma manifests differently. Silence can be as powerful as screams. But in the absence of adaptive gestures, emotional cues, and maternal instinct, the body doesn't lie, it merely withholds. What the McCanns presented in their first interview was not proof of guilt, but neither was it a portrait of heartbreak. It was precise, controlled, and sterile. And that, in a world where truth often leaks through trembling fingers or shattered voices, is sometimes enough to make people wonder. In the days following a child's disappearance, the world expects one thing from the parents: desperation. A breakdown on live TV, pleas for help, sleepless eyes, trembling voices, tear-streaked faces. But in the case of Gerry and Kate McCann, that wasn't what we got. Instead, within 48 hours of Madeline's disappearance, the couple was back on the tennis courts. 2 days after reporting their daughter missing, Gerry and Kate McCann were seen playing tennis at the Ocean Club Resort. While technically still within the bounds of their planned holiday, this decision sparked intense public backlash. To many, it came across as cold, callous, even offensive. How could two grieving parents return to leisure activities so quickly? Body language and trauma experts offered two competing interpretations. The first is psychological disassociation. In cases of extreme emotional trauma, some individuals separate mentally from the unbearable event. By retreating into routine or familiar behaviors, they insulate themselves from collapse. Returning to tennis within 48 hours can be interpreted as severe emotional disassociation or a psychological retreat from unbearable reality. The second interpretation is more calculated: image control. The McCanns were, from very early on, acutely aware of how they were being perceived. Tennis may have been less about distraction and more about maintaining the appearance of normalcy, calmness, and self-possession, qualities they believed would win public trust. But it backfired. In a cultural climate where raw grief is a currency of innocence, the absence of visible suffering became the very thing that fueled suspicion. If the tennis incident raised eyebrows, Gerry McCann's comment about Madeline's eye defect sent shockwaves. Madeline had a unique coloboma in her right eye, a distinct black mark in the iris. It was a physical feature that, if known publicly, would make her immediately identifiable. Portuguese police reportedly advised the McCanns not to release that detail, warning that it might endanger her life. The logic was simple. If a kidnapper knew the child was too recognizable to be safely hidden, they might dispose of the evidence, Madeline herself. Despite that, the McCanns released a high-profile image of Madeline wearing a red dress, with the eye defect prominently displayed. Gerry later commented, "We understood this might lead to her being harmed, but it is such a great marketing tool." To body language experts and psychologists, this comment revealed more than poor phrasing. It exposed a deep cognitive dissonance, the psychological tension that arises when one's beliefs clash with their actions. Gerry acknowledged the risk. He accepted the possibility that publicizing the eye defect could cost Madeline her life, and yet, he chose the strategy anyway, rationalizing that the attention it could bring outweighed the potential consequences. Calling the eye detail a marketing tool reveals a chilling separation between emotional response and PR strategy. This is a textbook cognitive dissonance event. Worse still, when he made the comment, his facial expression and body language showed no signs of inner conflict. No discomfort, no regret, just matter-of-fact delivery like a spokesperson reviewing campaign metrics. To many, this was not the reaction of a desperate father. It was the demeanor of a man running a brand. Rather than retreat into grief, the McCanns embarked on a full-scale media campaign within days of Madeline's disappearance. They held daily press conferences, always appearing polished, composed, and coordinated, launched the Find Madeline fund, registering it as a limited company, trademarked the look, logo, stylizing the to resemble Madeline's eye defect, appeared in international interviews, maintaining a consistent, rehearsed message. Instead of raw emotion, we saw messaging discipline. Instead of visible panic, we saw brand consistency. The focus was on managing perception, not pleading for recovery, and their bodies followed suit. No trembling hands, no voice cracks, no emotional leakage. Their posture remained upright. Eye contact was steady. Vocal delivery was smooth. These weren't the signals of people falling apart. These were the signals of professionals in control of a narrative. To some, that was admirable. To others, it was deeply suspicious. In behavioral psychology, there's a well-known phenomenon called duping delight. It refers to the subtle micro-expressions, often a fleeting smile or twinkle in the eye, that betray a person who feels pleasure in successfully deceiving others. In high-stakes cases, investigators look closely for such tells. But in hours of footage, Gerry and Kate McCann displayed no clear signs of duping delight. No lingering smirk. No mischievous eye flash. Nothing that screamed, "I got away with it." And yet, there were moments. Gerry chuckled lightly in some interviews, once when recalling the early days of the investigation. Once when referencing how good the holiday had been. Until that point, the public seized on those moments. Critics claimed those smiles were signs of guilt, of deception, of a man who couldn't contain his satisfaction at manipulating the world. But body language experts disagreed. Most people would say that's duping delight. But in this case, it isn't. Their smiles are weak. If they were faking grief, they'd fake better. Still, the absence of duping delight didn't equate to innocence. Instead, what was more troubling was the complete lack of any emotional signal at all. No explosive grief. No righteous anger. No disheveled panic. Not even fatigue. When people lie, they tend to overcompensate. They cry too hard. They add unnecessary details. They use emotional language to preempt doubt. The McCanns did none of that. If they're lying, they're better than trained spies. But if they're not lying, where is the pain? This paradox, the missing emotion, became the most haunting aspect of the McCann case. They didn't act like guilty people, but neither did they act like grieving parents. Instead, they acted like something else entirely: managers of a crisis, architects of a brand, strategists of a message. And while that doesn't prove guilt, it certainly left the world asking, what kind of parent plays tennis 2 days after their daughter vanishes? What kind of father calls a life-threatening eye condition marketing tool? What kind of grief is this, if it's grief at all? In high-profile criminal cases, particularly those involving missing children, investigators and the public alike often turn to body language experts to find the truth hidden between words. When emotions are raw, language alone isn't enough. Posture, micro-expressions, eye contact, and vocal tone often reveal more than rehearsed statements ever could. In the case of Madeleine McCann, 4 of the world's most seasoned behavioral analysts took on the task of interpreting what many consider to be the most critical piece of footage in the case: the McCanns' first televised interview, conducted just 3 weeks after Madeline vanished. This was not a press statement or a pre-scripted appeal. It was, in the eyes of these experts, the best chance to observe something unfiltered. The panel consisted of 4 globally respected figures in behavioral and nonverbal analysis: Scott Rose, a specialist in body language who trains agents from the FBI and CIA; Greg Hartley, a former military interrogator and resistance to interrogation instructor with decades of experience identifying deception under pressure. Chase Hughes, an authority in psychological warfare, persuasion, and behavioral profiling within military intelligence. Mark Bowden, a communications consultant and TEDx speaker known for his expertise in human behavior and influence in high-stakes environments. Together, these men, known collectively as the behavior panel, watched, paused, and rewound every movement and word in the McCanns' first interview. Each brought his own framework and insight. What emerged was a conclusion both unsettling and ambiguous. The first thing they looked for were the common physical cues associated with lying. These are near universal and rooted in evolutionary biology. Protecting the throat, a vulnerable area often shielded when someone feels under threat or guilt. Avoiding eye contact, shifting gaze when lying or withholding information. Topic shifting, a classic method of redirecting discomfort. Barrier gestures, like crossing arms or creating distance between speaker and listener. Disruption in speech patterns, such as stumbling, repeated words, or switching pronouns mid-sentence. But none of these were present. In their interview, Gerry and Kate McCann showed no classic markers of deception. Their eye contact was consistent. Their tone remained steady. They didn't fumble or stall. They didn't try to over-justify their actions. In fact, they didn't even offer what's known as a resume statement, the kind of defensive line often heard in guilty pleas. We're doctors. We love our children. We'd never hurt them. They don't try to convince. No resume statements, no overselling. And that's what makes it harder to read. Their composure, their restraint, it was all too clean. If the absence of deception was remarkable, so too was the absence of emotion. Throughout the interview, the McCanns remained stoic, no tears, no visible heartbreak, no shaking hands or cracking voices. Not even a single moment where they appeared to lose composure. Their faces stayed neutral. Their speech was linear, their posture upright. This led the experts to describe what they saw as an emotional flatline. They're not lying, but they're not grieving the way you expect. There's a stillness, a deadness, a complete lack of emotional spike. They weren't defensive. They weren't angry. They weren't distraught. They simply were. The McCanns showed no indication of being deceptive, but neither did they show the kind of visceral pain that is often present in cases of genuine loss or fear for a missing child. And that disconnect became one of the most striking takeaways from the analysis. Mark Bowden was perhaps the most measured in his response. He noted the absence of dramatization. There was no theatrical performance, no emotional sell. They simply spoke clearly, concisely, and with minimal physical expressiveness. We don't see them trying to act. There's no "please believe me" language, and that makes me think they're not lying. Chase Hughes took it further, expressing concern not about deception, but about the total vacuum of emotion. If they're faking this, they're the best actors we've ever seen. But I don't see any signs they're trying to fake grief either. The real question is, if they're telling the truth, where are their emotions? Greg Hartley pinpointed a very specific absentee fear. He said he saw evidence of sadness, yes, but not the kind of panic a parent would feel knowing their child might still be out there, hurt, terrified, or worse. I see deep sadness. But I don't see fear. I don't see the horror of imagining what Madeline might be going through. And that matters. Scott Rose summed it up with brutal clarity. I don't see deception, but I also don't see devastation. As a group, their conclusion was unanimous and chilling. They show profound sadness, but not necessarily fear for a still living child. These men weren't new to cases involving public displays of fake emotion. They had collectively studied Scott Peterson, who killed his wife Lassie and unborn child, then cried for cameras. They examined Chris Watts, the man who murdered his family, and then calmly begged for their return on live television. They reviewed the infamously erratic behavior of Casey Anthony, who smiled through interviews after her daughter's disappearance. In all of these cases, the guilty party overacted. They tried too hard. They cried too much. Their words and expressions didn't match. They were classic cases of incongruence, the mismatch between verbal language and body language that often signals a lie. By contrast, Gerry and Kate McCann showed no such incongruence. Their body language was in sync with their words. But therein lay a different kind of problem. They lacked any emotional resonance at all. They undersold their grief to the point that it became suspicious. When liars fake grief, they oversell it. The McCanns undersell it, and that's equally troubling. This isn't about deception, it's about emotional incongruence. The McCanns may not have lied. Their statements may have been technically accurate. Their facts may check out. But the absence of congruent emotional behavior created a strange, haunting dissonance for viewers and professionals alike. It's not that they were lying. It's that they weren't behaving the way the world expects grieving parents to behave. No begging, no screaming, no sense of being undone. Just control, composure, strategy. This disconnect between what we see and what we feel we should see is what continues to haunt the public discourse around the case. It's why so many people still question the McCanns, not because of what they did, but because of what they didn't do. In the end, the experts concluded that the McCanns' behavior didn't fit the mold of guilt, but it didn't fit the mold of innocence either. And sometimes, that space in between is the most unsettling of all. In every missing child case, photographs serve one critical purpose: recognition. The clearer and more recent the image, the higher the chance that someone might identify the child. But in the case of Madeleine McCann, the most circulated photos have sparked something else entirely: skepticism. One of the most debated pieces of visual evidence is what came to be known as the pool photo. According to the McCanns, this image was taken on the afternoon of May 3, 2007, the very day Madeline vanished. In the photo, Gerry McCann is sitting poolside with Madeline, who appears to be smiling, carefree. Kate McCann, also present, is dressed casually, her demeanor seemingly relaxed. On the surface, the image evokes a warm memory of a family on holiday. But beneath its serene exterior lies a sequence of red flags. The first issue is the metadata, or lack thereof. The EXIF data, the digital fingerprint embedded in most photographs, has never been publicly released. Without it, the exact time and date of the image remain unverifiable. This has prompted digital forensic experts and photo analysts to scrutinize every element within the frame. Their concerns are not superficial. The lighting in the photo does not appear consistent with the time of day it was reportedly taken. Shadows are soft, ambiguous. More critically, the clothing worn by both Kate and Madeline closely resembles outfits seen in earlier photos, taken 1 or 2 days before. Some observers have proposed a disturbing possibility that the photo was not taken on May 3rd at all, but rather selected or possibly even restaged to establish that Madeline was alive that afternoon. If true, the implications are profound, not simply about the timeline, but about the intentions behind curating such an image. A second photo that drew intense scrutiny is what has been dubbed the tennis photo. In it, Madeline stands on a tennis court, her expression cheerful. But the composition is peculiar. Several photo analysts argue that Madeline's figure appears to be cut out from another image and placed against the tennis background. There's no original, unedited version available for comparison, and again, no EXIF data has been released. While families often share flattering images of their children in times of crisis, the apparent manipulation of this photograph raised the question: was the goal truly to find Madeline or to engineer a media image? Perhaps most symbolic is the red dress photo, the one most widely circulated on Find Madeline posters. The image portrays Madeline in a vibrant red dress, smiling directly at the camera, with soft lighting and a polished composition. It's the kind of image that resonates emotionally. But there's a problem. It was reportedly taken 1 to 2 years before her disappearance. Critics have questioned why such an old photo was used. Why not publish a more recent image, perhaps from the holiday in Praia da Luz, that more accurately reflected her current appearance, hairstyle, height, even facial maturity? The delay in releasing photos also raised eyebrows. The first public image did not appear until more than 24 hours after Madeline's disappearance, an eternity in child abduction cases, where each hour dramatically reduces the chances of recovery. Some questioned whether there were no suitable recent images available. Others wondered whether the omission was strategic. In one interview, when Gerry McCann was asked about the origins of the now infamous pool photo, his response raised further alarm among body language experts. Instead of offering a direct answer, he launched into what analysts call over-explaining, a form of cognitive stress that occurs when an individual feels the need to justify or control the narrative. His tone became technical, clinical, as though he were presenting a report. His eye contact became erratic. There was no emotional charge in his voice, no hesitancy typical of a parent recalling a heartbreaking day. Instead, he explained in precise, detached terms. This, experts argue, is not a sign of deception per se, but a sign of a rehearsed or overly managed account. Over-explaining is a red flag. One analyst noted, when someone is telling the truth, they answer. When they feel the need to justify, they're trying to control perception. This observation ties into a deeper, more uncomfortable psychological hypothesis: controlled narrative. From the beginning, the photos used by the McCanns and their representatives seemed less about finding Madeline and more about constructing an emotional brand. The images were warm, clean, emotionally appealing. Madeline appeared angelic. The family looked ideal. The message wasn't, look at this real, tangible child who could be anywhere. The message was, feel something about this child. Such emotional framing serves a powerful psychological function. It generates public sympathy, drives media attention, and creates a sense of innocence that is difficult to challenge. But in cases like this, where public trust hinges on authenticity, the use of curated or potentially manipulated imagery can backfire. What was meant to inspire action instead fuels doubt. In missing children cases, said one investigator, photos are for recognition. When they're used for branding, the priority changes from rescue to reputation. The McCann's image strategy continued beyond just the photos. A copyright was even registered for the word bloke, stylized with a slashed O, the same slashed iris that Madeline had in one eye. This detail, meant to enhance recognition, was later described by Gerry McCann as a great marketing tool. The phrase triggered an avalanche of criticism. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. His tone, once again, was devoid of the emotional intensity one might expect from a father speaking about his missing child. There was no tremble in his voice, no emotional shift, just the cold, precise diction of someone delivering a strategy briefing. In this context, the photos became more than visual aids. They became psychological artifacts, windows not just into the child's appearance, but into the intentions of those releasing them. Each image told two stories, the one that was visible and the one that was absent. The absence, in this case, is haunting. Absent are photos from the day of the disappearance, taken spontaneously. Absent are images that capture Madeline as she was unscripted, real. Absent, too, is the raw emotional urgency that defines most missing child appeals. And yet, what remains is a polished portfolio of symbolic imagery, carefully selected, intentionally deployed. Whether this was a calculated effort to control public perception, or simply a misguided media strategy, the result is the same: a growing disconnect between what is seen and what is felt. In a case already drowning in ambiguity, the photos meant to bring clarity have only deepened the shadows. In the countless hours of interviews given by Gerry and Kate McCann following the disappearance of their daughter, Madeline, one striking void lingers in the minds of both experts and the public alike. Despite the media saturation, the emotional appeals, and the intense global focus, something is consistently absent. Not once across every recorded appearance did the couple explicitly acknowledge what their daughter might be feeling. There was no mention of fear, no speculation that Madeline, wherever she might be, could be frightened, cold, or crying out for help. No fleeting reflection on her confusion, her need for comfort, or her terror in the face of strangers. Instead, the discourse centered primarily around past tense reflections: how she looked, how she smiled, how perfect she was. It's not simply that they didn't imagine her pain, it's that they never gave voice to that possibility. To trained observers, this absence is not subtle. It is profound. The term most often used by body language experts and behavioral psychologists is emotional disconnection. In the realm of missing children, especially for parents confronting the unknown, this kind of disassociation from the child's present emotional state is uncommon and alarming. Most parents, when confronted with such loss, express pain not just for themselves but for what their child must be enduring. They ask questions that no one can answer. Is she scared? Is someone hurting her? Is she asking for me? In the McCanns case, none of these questions ever came. The silence on Madeline's experience wasn't just eerie, it was unnatural. Equally telling was the absence of any rage. Throughout press conferences, sit-down interviews, and public statements, Gerry and Kate McCann never once expressed anger toward the person or people who may have taken their daughter. There were no cries for justice, no pleas for the abductor to return Madeline safely, no outbursts of fury, no clenched fists, no moments of losing composure at the thought of someone harming their little girl. In similar cases, such expressions are almost inevitable. Parents lash out. They scream into cameras. They demand action. They curse the faceless monster that took away their world. In contrast, the McCanns remained too composed. Some defenders cite shock, trauma, or grief as the explanation. And certainly, trauma manifests differently in different people. But over time, most grieving parents display at least some range of emotion: anger, desperation, denial, bargaining. With the McCanns, the emotional register appeared frozen. There was no escalation, no catharsis, no breakdowns caught on camera, not even a single on-screen moment of trembling or incoherence that would typically mark genuine heartbreak. This leads to the third unsettling absence: the absence of breakdown. Across all known footage, there is not a single instance where either Gerry or Kate truly breaks. No sobbing, no gasping for air, no shaking shoulders or desperate pleas. Their voices remain steady, their expressions neutral, their posture upright. Kate may occasionally appear withdrawn, even frail but not undone. Gerry often appears stoic, analytical, never enraged, never desperate. Experts watching these interactions refer to it as an emotional flatline. It is not that sadness was entirely absent, but rather that it remained curiously controlled, constricted, muted, almost anesthetized. One prominent body language expert put it plainly: there was no resume statement, no eye-blocking deception, no defensiveness, but also no life. That is, they showed no signs of classic deception, no excessive eye blinking, no self-soothing gestures, no fidgeting or evasion. They didn't try to justify themselves or oversell their innocence with grandiose claims like, "We would never do this, we're doctors." They didn't shift blame. They didn't deflect. But they also didn't exhibit any of the human signals we expect from grieving parents. This lack of contradiction, in fact, made things more confusing. In most lie detection scenarios, inconsistencies between words and expressions, so-called incongruences, are red flags. But in the McCanns case, what stood out wasn't contradiction, it was vacuum. Their answers were consistent, too consistent. Their tone was stable, their narrative well rehearsed. If they were lying, they weren't showing the usual giveaways. But if they were telling the truth, where was the pulse? This is the question that continues to haunt both analysts and laypeople. If this was the truth, why did it feel so sterile, so emotionally inert? The eye doesn't lie, and in every close-up, neither Kate nor Gerry displayed the dilated pupils, the shallow breathing, the flushing, or the trembling that typically accompany traumatic recounting. There was no shaking voice, no desperate inflection, no cracking when mentioning their daughter's name. Even the brief moments of stillness, rather than being charged with pain, often appeared empty, like pauses in a scripted delivery, rather than the mental collapse of a grieving parent. Experts agree, if this is the truth, it is the coldest version of it ever told. some suggest the McCanns' demeanor might stem from medical training. As physicians, they are trained to regulate emotion, to maintain composure during distressing situations. Others argue that the emotional flatline might be a psychological defense, a way to survive the unbearable. But this still leaves a gaping hole in the heart of the case. Why? Across hundreds of appearances, was there never a single moment of uncontrollable humanity? Why didn't they say Madeline's name with a cracking voice? Why didn't they scream into the void for the person who took her? Why did it always sound like a press release and never like a cry for help? These are not questions rooted in accusation. They are questions born from human expectation. When a child is taken, society expects a raw, desperate, unapologetic form of parental agony. The McCanns, for all their composure and discipline, never once gave the world that glimpse, and in that absence, suspicion took root. Because in true grief, there is always a moment, just one, that breaks through the mask. A glance, a gasp, a trembling hand. But in this case, there was none, no flicker, no heartbeat, no sign of life. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling part of all. Gerry McCann was not just a father at the center of one of the most high-profile child disappearance cases in modern history. He was also a professor of cardiology at the University of Leicester, a man of science, precision, and emotional restraint. His professional identity became an unspoken lens through which every word, gesture, and silence was analyzed. In the court of public opinion, that lens proved both a shield and a source of scrutiny. As a clinical cardiologist, Gerry was trained to function under intense pressure. The ability to remain calm, to think rationally, and to communicate clearly during life or death situations is not just encouraged, it is required. Delivering bad news, explaining risk, and managing patient distress are all done with measured tone and controlled expression. In a hospital, this composure signals competence. In a missing child case, it can be misread as detachment. This professional detachment may explain Gerry's steady voice, his logical explanations, and his absence of outward emotional breakdowns. But it also placed him in conflict with what the public expects from a grieving father. Where society anticipates chaos, Gerry offered clarity. Where they yearn for tears, he offered statements. This incongruity between role and reality, between societal expectations and medical conditioning, formed the backdrop of deeper psychological interpretations. Medical professionals, especially those in high-stakes fields like cardiology, are trained to compartmentalize. Emotional regulation is a survival mechanism. In high adrenaline environments, panic can cost lives. Doctors must suppress their internal reactions to remain effective for others. This training becomes second nature. Over time, the line between authentic emotion and controlled response can blur. Gerry's controlled demeanor, however, did not exist in a vacuum. In the context of a missing child, especially one of his own, emotional suppression reads differently. It doesn't just seem stoic, it seems cold. Observers questioned whether his calm was protective professionalism or something more troubling. While some saw a man coping through discipline, others saw a man too composed to be believable. This clash of frameworks, clinical training versus public grief, became one of the central tensions in the way Gerry was perceived. Layered beneath this, however, are two deeper forms of guilt, one acknowledged, the other possibly hidden. The explicit guilt is known and visible. Gerry and Kate McCann left their children unattended in a holiday apartment while they dined with friends nearby. This decision, later described as a mistake by both parents, is the kind of action that can haunt a person forever. In interviews, traces of this guilt surface in phrases like, "We thought it was safe," or "We did what many others did." These attempts to rationalize reveal not just regret, but a need for self-forgiveness. The pressure to be both grieving parent and responsible adult becomes a psychological burden. But it is the idea of concealed guilt that has drawn sustained public and expert curiosity. This is the notion that Gerry and possibly Kate may know more than they have disclosed. It does not necessarily imply direct involvement in wrongdoing. Rather, it raises the possibility of withheld knowledge, details that, if revealed, could change the narrative, ignite controversy, or expose legal vulnerabilities. Indicators of this concealed guilt may include behavioral avoidance, never describing Madeline's potential fear or pain, never speaking about the night with emotional specificity, and never engaging in empathetic projections of what Madeline might be experiencing. Instead, the public messaging focused on broader issues: media management, organized campaigns, and legal defense. The emotional core fear for Madeline's present suffering was conspicuously absent. This duality of guilt explicit and concealed creates what psychologists call cognitive suppression. The speaker must juggle two mental states, a need to maintain control and a need to suppress what must not be said. This leads to overly structured speech, a flattening of emotion, and a robotic form of engagement. Viewers sense something is off not because of overt deception, but because of an emotional vacuum. This emotional vacuum becomes most apparent in Gerry's now infamous quote, "What's done is done, and we have to move forward." At first glance, it's a pragmatic statement. In reality, it reveals layers of psychological self-preservation. The phrase, "what's done is done," belongs to a category known in psychological linguistics as absolution language. It is designed not to absolve others but oneself. It acknowledges past error while signaling that emotional engagement with that error is now closed. It shifts focus from grief to action. It suggests resolution rather than remorse. And yet, the timing and tone of this phrase mattered deeply. When Gerry spoke these words, only a short time had passed since Madeline's disappearance. For most parents in such a situation, the rawness of loss would prevent this level of detachment. A parent still hoping to find their child would rarely say, "It's done." They would say, "I wish I could go back," or "I can't forgive myself," or "I won't rest until I know." But Gerry's delivery was different. Experts who reviewed the video noted his flat tone, unchanging facial expression, and absence of micro-expressions that often accompany intense emotional recall. His gaze did not drift downward in shame. His voice did not tremble. His hands did not clench. These absences do not prove deception, but they raise questions about emotional congruence. In comparison, other parents in high-profile child disappearance cases have shown the opposite pattern. They express chaotic grief. They cry uncontrollably. They show desperation. While this doesn't confirm innocence, it communicates pain in a way that resonates with viewers. Gerry's controlled speech, though possibly rooted in his profession, lacked that resonance. The public reaction to "what's done is done" was swift. For some, it confirmed their doubts. For others, it was a sign of a man trying to keep himself from falling apart. For behavioral analysts, it was a revealing moment, a snapshot of a man whose inner world was at war with public expectation. When these behavioral inconsistencies are viewed collectively, the calm tone, the structured answers, the emotional restraint, they paint a portrait not of guilt, but of profound internal conflict. Whether that conflict is the result of training, trauma, or untold truths remains unclear. But it is this ambiguity, more than any single statement or silence, that keeps the world asking questions. Because in cases like this, the heart of the mystery often lies not in what is said, but in what is missing. When the world first saw Kate and Gerry McCann appear on television, just weeks after the disappearance of their daughter Madeline, the public expected visible pain, pleading eyes, and perhaps even emotional collapse. But instead, what they got was control, poise, and almost surgical calm. To decipher what lay beneath the surface, four of the world's leading body language experts, Scott Rose, Greg Hartley, Chase Hughes, and Mark Bowden, gathered to review hours of footage of the McCanns' interviews. These were not casual observers. They were professionals who had trained the FBI, interrogated war criminals, advised intelligence units, and studied micro-behaviors in some of the world's most deceptive individuals. Yet in this case, their consensus was oddly unanimous and deeply inconclusive. All four experts agreed there were no textbook signs of deception. Gerry and Kate McCann did not cover their throats, a natural gesture. When one feels exposed or guilty, They didn't avoid eye contact, didn't shift topics erratically, and their facial muscles showed no spikes of stress under pressure. Their voices stayed steady. Their answers, though deeply rehearsed, were clear and coherent. There was no resume statement, no attempt to prove their innocence by asserting their moral standing as doctors or parents. They didn't oversell their story. They didn't try too hard. They don't oversell. They don't deflect. That makes it harder, not easier, to read them, one expert noted. In short, the McCanns weren't showing signs of lying, but they weren't showing signs of feeling either. This is where the analysis turned from forensics to psychology. While there was no evidence of deception, what struck the panel more profoundly was what was missing. There was no grief, no rage, no trembling hands, no choked voice, no moment across dozens of appearances when the facade cracked. Not once did Kate collapse into tears. Not once did Gerry shout or even express anger toward whoever might have taken their daughter. What was also missing was Madeline, not physically, of course, but emotionally. Neither parent spoke about how frightened their daughter might be or how much pain she could be enduring. There was no projection of her suffering, no imagined cries for help, no desperate longing to describe the emotional state of their missing child. There's no deception, another expert said, but there's also no pulse. Their faces, particularly Gerry's, were often described as deadpan flat, drained of energy. Their tone was that of a spokesperson rather than grieving parents. Their hands rested calmly. Their shoulders were not weighed down by grief. Instead, every gesture felt contained, scripted, correct. To be fair, trauma doesn't look the same on everyone. Some people collapse. Others go silent. And for medical professionals like the McCanns, Gerry, being a cardiologist trained to deliver life and death news, it is possible that emotional detachment was a conditioned response. Perhaps what the world was witnessing was not deceit but disassociation. But even this line of reasoning has its limits. As the experts pointed out, if the McCanns were truly in a state of post-traumatic stress, then where were the involuntary signs? People with PTSD often experience emotional outbursts, inconsistent language, and fragmented recall. In contrast, Gerry and Kate remained consistently composed. They never misspoke, never contradicted themselves, never once showed the messiness that comes with real human suffering. If this is real grief, where's the chaos? Where's the breakdown? Where is the noise that comes with panic, guilt, or desperation? And perhaps most concerning, nothing ever felt spontaneous. Every public appearance, every campaign photo, every press interaction felt tightly orchestrated. Images were carefully chosen. Statements were concise. Messaging was unified. There were no human errors in speech or behavior that typically signal real-time grief. Instead, it all felt as if it had been practiced, controlled. Everything is too perfect, too aligned. Where's the mess that comes with real grief? In the end, the experts did not accuse. They could not. There was no definitive evidence of a lie, no nervous twitch that gave the game away, no Freudian slip. But their final conclusion was chilling, not because of what they found, but because of what they couldn't find. "We're not saying they lied," one expert said. "We're saying we couldn't find the person behind the story." There's no evidence of deception, but there's also no evidence of authentic emotional chaos. No one knows the truth. But one thing is certain: the body doesn't lie. What made the case so haunting, in their view, wasn't a single tell. It wasn't a slip of the tongue or a guilty expression. It was the void, the complete absence of the human struggle that typically follows such unimaginable loss. What these experts offered was not judgment, but a mirror. They laid bare the nonverbal story and left the final interpretation to the viewer. Their goal was not to point fingers but to prompt questions. What do you believe when you watch Kate sit still as stone? What do you feel when Gerry smiles briefly while discussing the day his daughter vanished? What do you make of their polished calm, 3 weeks into the disappearance of a child? Now that you've seen their eyes, their hands, their silence, what do you believe? Because in the end, truth has more than one voice, and sometimes the loudest one is the one that says nothing at all.